So, I'm Jim Butler with the Kansas Geological Survey, and I had some questions about the survey itself. So let me just start with a brief intro. The Kansas Geological Survey, the KGS, is a research and service unit of the University of Kansas. Our offices are in Lawrence. We have no regulatory or policy-making function. Our mission, essentially when you cut to the chase, is to provide a sound scientific foundation for decision-making on natural resources issues within the state of Kansas, which I think is similar to probably what you all do here in Nebraska. So obviously, one of our big natural resources is the groundwater of the High Plains Aquifer. Now, let me see if I can get this stuff. I've got to say, I'm one of these speakers who likes to move around, so I'm feeling kind of trapped, caged up here, and I can't see the screen as well as I can, I'll jabber toward it at times. So the High Plains Aquifer, I think this audience knows it well. So just real quickly, for those who may not be real clear on it, this is one of the world's most important regional aquifers when it comes to the agricultural production that it produces. Extends over 8 states in the central U.S. I've extracted Kansas from the mix here on this slide, but I just want to emphasize the importance of the agricultural production that is supported by the water of this aquifer, not just for the kind of the immediate vicinity, our region, but for our nation and globally as well. The world needs the production of the High Plains Aquifer, the production that the High Plains Aquifer supports. And here in Nebraska, I think the future looks good in terms of the aquifer's conditions, but that is not necessarily the conditions to the south. So I'm going to give you all kind of an overview of where things stand in Kansas and some of the things that we're trying to address, the challenges that we face. So in this slide here, you can see the High Plains Aquifer in Kansas is in tan, and obviously you can see there's a big difference between the distribution of the aquifer in Nebraska and that in Kansas. Nebraska extends almost over the entire state, whereas in Kansas it's distributed into the sparsely more than sparse. It's distributed in the western third to half of the state, but not real densely. And as a result of that distribution, we face challenges that Nebraska does not face over the full extent of its aquifer. So this aquifer in Kansas, just like in all the other states in the High Plains, has been intensively utilized for decades in support of irrigated agriculture. Now, this intensive utilization has come at a price, and I want to illustrate that price. This is a map of the percent change in aquifer thickness since the onset of widespread pumping for irrigation in Kansas, since pre-development, which we typically think of in the 40s and early 50s in Kansas. On this map, the blue areas are areas of aquifer increase. Everything else is aquifer decrease. And I should point out that the blues in the western third of the state were very thin aquifer intervals to begin with, and so are not of practical importance. And so just looking at this map, you can see in Kansas, there are 2 stories to tell about the High Plains Aquifer. Notice all the reds that you see in the western third of the state, with the darkest reds being the areas where over 60% of the aquifer has been depleted, and it's not coming back. But then you go into south central Kansas and you see a predominance of tannish colors, indicate relatively small declines in water level since pre-development. What is the major driving factor for that? It's precipitation. Just like in Nebraska, in Kansas, we have a strong east to west decline in annual precipitation across the state. So say in northeastern Kansas, Lawrence, which is my home, and I should just clarify, it is also the home of the noble and inspirational Jayhawk, as I think most of you do know. But anyway, our average annual rainfall is around 38, 39 inches. You get on the border with Colorado, it's under 18. And that gradient in annual precipitation is primarily responsible for all the colors we're seeing. The reds we see here, western third of the state, semi-arid conditions, heavily depend on groundwater. As you move into south central Kansas, they use a lot of groundwater, but it's more of a subhumid conditions, so they get a lot more recharge than they do out west. So in this presentation, I'm going to focus on the western third of the state. But you look at this and you say, wow, the pumping has really had an impact on terms of aquifer conditions. But there's also been collateral damage, so to speak, in terms of our surface waters. So I wanted to give you a feel for how this intensive utilization of the aquifer, particularly out west, has caused a change in the surface water conditions in western Kansas. So what I've got here is two maps, one in 61, one in 94, and there's been one more recently done, but the message is the same as you see in 94. This is done by the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. Major perennial streams in Kansas in 61, you can see that the western third of the state was not blessed with a great deal of surface water, but by 94, there's a heck of a lot less. And the reason for this, frankly, is these streams out west were groundwater fed. With the water table above the stream, you're feeding groundwater into the stream channel. Intensive pumping has reversed that relationship and drained the streams and created this condition. We've got a long-term research site along, which I'm marking here with this red triangle, along what we call the Arkansas River. And I just want to clarify, we got it right in terms of the pronunciation. I'd be happy to take questions afterwards about my justification for that statement. But I just want to show you what typically the view has been since 2001 at this research site. This is one of the supposed major rivers of the state, and it's basically bone dry, I would say 90-95% of the time. The phreatophytes, the mulberries, and the cottonwoods you see there are still able to hang on, but if you go upstream, they also die off, and it becomes a very dispiriting sight. Now, this river, the Arkansas, is one of 3 rivers in Kansas that's legally classified as navigable. Now, obviously, that's via the ATV route now. Okay, so this is a condition we have in Kansas. The aquifer's under heavy stress in the western third of the state and has produced some collateral damage in terms of our surface water conditions. The focus of this presentation is going to be, where do we go from here? What does the future hold for this aquifer? And is there anything we can do to attempt to better conditions? But before launching into that, let me just give you some background information about the High Plains Aquifer in Kansas. So if I start using phrases, you just don't get lost in my gibberish. So in Kansas, we take the High Plains Aquifer and we segment it into 3 components. In the western third of the state, we call that the Ogallala Aquifer, or the Ogallala component of the High Plains Aquifer. In south central Kansas, south of the Great Bend of the Arkansas River is a Great Bend Prairie Aquifer, and then we have the aquifer north of Wichita, the Equus Beds Aquifer, which is an important supply of water, not just for irrigated agriculture, but also for the city of Wichita. So those are the 3 parts of the aquifer. Just wanted to get that across. Second, if we're going to talk about what the future holds for the aquifer, we need to have an understanding of how it responds to pumping and the like. We need data. So I just wanted to spend a minute talking about the types of data that we have, and in particular 2 types that we have found very useful in terms of helping us assess what the future may hold. Start off. Water levels. We have an annual water level measurement program. First week to 10 days of January, every year, the Kansas Geological Survey and the Division of Water Resources, the Kansas Department of Agriculture, we send out teams that measure water levels in a network of approximately 1,400 wells across the High Plains Aquifer in Kansas. We do it in January, 3 to 4 months after cessation of irrigation pumping, so that measurement is not going to be highly sensitive to year-to-year variations in the timing of the end of the irrigation season. So there's not too much noise introduced by that factor. Say if you did it in late October or early November, you're going to have a fair amount of noise there. So we do it in January. We've done this for decades. And so we've got a good picture of how water levels have changed through time, and this is the data set that was used to create the map that I showed earlier. Now, water level changes, it's important, but we also have to remember that those water level changes are in response to some sort of stress or driver on the system. And that stress, obviously, is pumping. So in Kansas, we are, and I can say this with great confidence, we are the nation's leader in terms of the percentage of non-domestic pumping wells that have totalizing flow meters. Back there was a survey by USDA in, I think it was 2012, and at that point, 88% of our wells had totalizing flow meters. Now it's like 98 to 99%. That time in Nebraska, I think you had maybe 38, 39% of the wells, which was a good percentage for the United States. But you beat us because you have so many wells. The total number of wells metered in Nebraska exceeded those metered in Kansas. We just have a higher percentage of our wells metered. But it's just not metering the wells. We also have that regulatory verification step, which we found is critical. So the idea here is that the regulatory agency in Kansas can come onto your land, clamp an calibrated ultrasonic flow meter adjacent to your flow meter. You have to be within 6%. If not, you need to repair it if you're found to be tampering. The penalties, which recently were raised, are quite harsh. So the water level data and the water use data, pumping data, gives great insights into what the past behavior of the aquifer, and from that we can project into the future. One other bit of background information I wanted to go over, and that's groundwater management. As everybody knows, that's a state responsibility here in the U.S. In Kansas, we have a single agency, the Division of Water Resources of the Kansas Department of Agriculture, that handles both surface water and groundwater together as an integrated whole. The chief engineer is the head of that division, and he has to consider the interaction between groundwater and surface water when considering applications for new water rights. And in Kansas, our water rights system is the same for both surface and groundwater, and it's prior appropriation, first in time, first in right. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Okay. So I just wanted to get that background so y'all had a little bit of understanding of what we work with and the kind of the framework in which we're working. So, one other point is the Division of Water Resources of the Kansas Department of Agriculture does not work alone. It is assisted by the 5 groundwater management districts we have in Kansas, or GMDs. And these GMDs enable the local community to have some input into management decisions. They can propose management programs, initiatives, and the like. However, they must fit within the framework of Kansas water law, and they must be approved by the chief engineer. So they're not independent on their own. Everything has to go up through the chief engineer's office. Now I can go to where I was anticipating, back to this map, and the question is, where do we go from here? Now, I think everyone just looking at this map, especially in the Ogallala portion of the aquifer, the western third of the state, you can see business as usual. If we just keep on doing what we've doing, that is not going to end well for many areas of that region. So we get asked a lot about what can be done to moderate the rate of declines in Ogallala aquifer. Is there any chance of stabilizing water levels for at least the near term? Now, the bottom line is we have to reduce pumping. That's it. Now, one option is to say, okay, we'll reduce groundwater pumping, but we'll irrigate the same amount because we'll just replace the groundwater with surface water. Now, in Kansas, in western Kansas, as you saw from the earlier maps, there is no surface water to be had. As a result, many of you may have heard of the proposals that have been advanced to basically take water from the Missouri River in northeastern Kansas and basically put it in canals and send it out to western Kansas, an aqueduct type proposal. And most recently, that has been tied in with, there's an attempt to tie it in with the needs of the Front Range, with the idea of having some municipalities that can help foot the bill. Now, regardless of your thoughts about the merits of such a project, I think we can all agree that it's not happening anytime soon. It's not going to happen for the foreseeable future, and I'm defining that for this presentation as the next 50 years. So we can't go with the replacement option. So how about irrigation use efficiency? There have been great improvements in irrigation use efficiency. Can we count on continuation of those to get the reductions that we need? Well, we can just look at the data, the past behavior, and ask the question in Kansas, has irrigation efficiency, or have irrigation efficiency improvements led to actual water conservation? And I mean, clearly over the last 20 plus years, there have been significant advances in the efficiency of water use and irrigation. But has that mattered in terms of water conservation? Well, we looked at this in Kansas, and our analysis from '96 on could find no indication that these efficiency improvements have led to water conservation, to actual pumping reductions. Our interpretation is that folks have used that additional water to change the crop mix or to increase irrigation acreage. But there's no indication that there has been any water conservation. And we do that by comparing water use for similar climatic conditions from near the start of the period and at the end. And we'll talk about, I've got an example here in a minute where I'll show you the type of thing we do with that. Now, I know there's some economists in the audience, and they're probably just nodding their head. You know, the natural resource economists have understood this idea that efficiency improvements do not necessarily lead to conservation for over 150 years. I think Jevons paradox is basically related to this, so that's bandied about by natural resource economists. So this is no surprise to them. It was a little bit to us, but now when we think about it a bit, we realize this is not going to bail us out unless we couple those improvements with some sort of regulatory cap on total water use, which I'll get to in a minute. So irrigation efficiency improvements have not, and as traditionally done, do not appear to be a solution to reduce water use in this area. So another option is just to follow the law. Kansas, a water law, it's prior appropriations, first in time, first in right. You cannot impair, a junior user cannot impair a more senior individual, and impair in Kansas is defined on economic terms. If so, then water rights administration. You can actually go in and have folks shut off because they're impairing you. Now, obviously, that's not a very neighborly thing to do. And as a result, there's a great deal of pressure applied not to actually implement the legal solution that exists on the books. And whether it's the state engineer has some tools that he could use to do this. The individual water rights holders could ask the chief engineer to help them address the impairment claims. But with very few exceptions, this has not been resorted to in the Ogallala Aquifer, despite all the water level declines. There's just intense social and political pressure not to go in this direction. The only case that I know of is a high-profile case in southwest Kansas in Haskell County where a senior right holder did shut down, actually going through the courts to shut down 5 wells that were impairing him. That had been determined by the Division of Water Resources to be impairing his ability to pump. But he met with very, very harsh criticism across the region. So I doubt there's going to be many others following that path. So what can we do? Well, in the last decade in Kansas, we've gotten a couple of new options, management options, that have great potential for encouraging conservation. And I put a map of the groundwater management districts up here because these basically are brainchilds of the long-time, although now retired, manager of groundwater management district number 4, Wayne Bossert. And he came up with the basic concept for these options, which is grassroots-driven suggestion proposals that are then supported by regulatory oversight. And I'm going to focus on one, the Local Enhanced Management Area, or LEMA, which is the best known. But the other, this Water Conservation Area, is similar in concept. They differ a bit in the details. And I also should note, and I don't know about Nebraska, in Kansas and the water resources community, we love acronyms, okay? So I trust Nebraska is similarly bought in to the acronym concept. So LEMA is what I'll use. One time I was out on a pumping test doing a night shift with the generator there, and I came up with this, I was so proud of myself, this is 20 years ago, I came up with this acronym Sasquatch. But nobody really bought into that one. So anyway, back in 2013, the first LEMA, Local Enhanced Management Area, was established in northwest Kansas in a 99 square mile area. And I just want to talk about how they've done. It was established for a 5-year period, and then in 17, they renewed the proposal for another 5 years, the arrangement for another 5 years. And we have data from the first 5 years of this, and so I want to talk about it. So, why did they set this up? So I've got 2 maps here. To your upper left is groundwater pumping. Notice the area I've circled in red there in northwest Kansas. That's a hot spot of pumping, with the warmer colors being greater intensity of pumping. In the lower right, you have a map of water level change from 96 to 2012. And again, you can see that was an area, a hot spot for water level change in that area. Over 20 feet lost and from 96 to 2012. Now, you'll also note there in southwest Kansas that they were getting a heck of a lot more water level declines over that same period. Why didn't they get involved here? And the answer is simply saturated thickness. They've got a lot more saturated thickness, aquifer thickness there in southwest Kansas than they do in northwest. So these guys in the circled area, there's in Sheridan, mostly in Sheridan County in northwest Kansas, they had in 2012, they had between 50 and 80 feet of aquifer left, and we're losing 2 feet a year. So they recognized something needed to be done. And so they got together, a group of them got together in this region, 99 square mile area, and they had a vote. And the idea behind this Leamas framework is majority rules. And so the majority voted to cut pumping by 20%. And so everybody then has to play ball by on the agreed upon arrangement, and the state regulatory agency comes in to make sure everybody is performing according to the expectations of the legally binding agreement. And so they cut pumping back, so 11 inches per acre was the application, but they had the flexibility to use it as they saw fit over 5 years. So it's 55 inches over 5 years. So the question is, did this make a big impact? Did they really reduce pumping close to their aspiration of 20%? So this is an empirical approach that we developed at the survey, very simple in concept, is we plot annual water use, which is on the y-axis here in 1,000 of acre feet, and we plot it against precipitation or some climatic index on the x-axis. Here we're using radar precipitation, which we had in this area from 2005 on. So I'm looking at radar precipitation, water use relationship from 2005 to 2012. This is the run-up to the Leamas. Remember, the Leamas started in 2013. And as we found across the High Plains Aquifer in Kansas, these plots are quite linear. Here the R-square is about 0.7, and this is true across the High Plains Aquifer in Kansas. When we have high-quality pumping data, we get very good relationships. So there it is. It looks like a consistent agricultural practices in the 2005 to 12 period. Now let's go into the Leamas, the first 5 years of the Leamas, 2013 to 17. Notice the distinct offset there as the water use has clearly dropped. And with this plotting framework, you can see we control for climatic conditions, because you can just take a radar precipitation, just move up vertically and see the difference. So this is the idea. If you're assessing whether these measures actually are conserving water, you have to control for climatic conditions. So a couple things to note here. One, notice the much tighter fit there on the linear relationship, R-square like 0.93. Well, this is the regulatory oversight. Everybody had to have their meter. It had to be working really well, and it was being checked. So you got much higher quality data there. Second, notice that this period, 13 to 17, was a period normal to wet conditions. So this area this Leamas area has yet to be challenged by the drought such as we had in 2012 there in northwest Kansas. But in normal to wet conditions, the water use reduction that they've achieved is 27%, on average is 27%, which exceeds their expectation, but maybe eventually when we do see a drought, maybe we'll find that 20% is about right when you consider in the full gambit of climatic possibilities. But it could be they've changed their practices, so maybe that linear relation will extend out and they'll be able to maintain the 25, 27% reduction in water use. How did they get there? Well, they changed crop mix, as you might imagine, grew a lot more sorghum, and also much more strategic about water application, so using soil moisture sensors and the like. And what they discovered is that they were putting too much water on their fields in normal to wet conditions. And I think this is a recent paper by folks here at UNL in Environmental Research Letters, basically looking, I think it was Republican, one of the natural resource districts out west, came up with a similar conclusion as well. Soil moisture sensors have really been a game changer, I think, in this regard to help folks realize when they need to water and maybe when not. So in terms of reduction in water use, they've been successful. Now, how about the area around them? So we did a study looking at what we call the control area, which is just 2 to 3 townships in width around the Lima. The Lima's in green. The control area is, what is that, purple? And we looked at how did those guys do, and we looked at both the economic side of things and we looked at the hydrologic side of things. So economically, went with Bill Golden, an agricultural economist at Kansas State University, and he was able to get some of the producers' records from both areas, and based on his analysis, it was basically a wash in terms of net income. The gross income for the folks in the control area was larger, but the net was essentially the same as the folks in the Lima. So they were able to reduce pumping by 27%, and it did not affect their bottom line, which I thought was very, very interesting. Of course, again, we have to all consider the fact that this area has not been tested yet by drought conditions. So we also looked at the water use relationships that they had there in the control area. And so what I've got here is a plot of, again, water use in thousands of acre feet. They're on 2 y-axis. That would be your left. The axis in blue is the area inside the Lima. And then on the right side, we have the control area. The water use was slightly lower in the control area than in the Lima. So you'll note that I've shifted the y-axis upward a bit. The range is the same on both y-axes, but I've shifted them a bit so I could overlay the 2 plots. The blue line is just the best fit line that I showed earlier for the pre-Lima run-up, and the red line is a similar fit to the data in that control area. And you can see that basically they were using the same agricultural practices. I mean, these lines essentially overlap. The R-squareds are about 0.7 in both cases. So now let's look at the Lima time, 2013 to 17. So the blue points are what I showed earlier. The red points are the same years for the control area. Notice 2013 through 16, they fall basically on that same red line as the pre-Lima run-up. But then in 17, notice it's dropped off and is much closer to the relationships to the values seen in the Lima, under the Lima conditions. Now, this was also the wettest year since at least 2002 for this area, so this may just be kind of a one-off situation, or it could be that there's some diffusion, that folks in this outer area are seeing, hey, these guys are able to reduce water use, make just as much money as me, and therefore they're going to be able to make, because they reduce use, they're going to be able to make money for considerably longer time than I did. We don't know which it is, and over time, just continuing assessment like this, we'll be able to see here in the next few years. But simple empirical approaches can give us some deep insights into what's going on. So this is all talking about water use. Bottom line is what's happened to the water levels. And our data in the control area is pretty sketchy on this point, but so I'm going to focus on the Lima itself. We had 10, and we now have 10 monitoring wells in the Lima area. And so what we've done at the survey is we've developed a new approach, a new theoretical framework for looking at water level change and water use data for conditions common to the High Plains Aquifer in Kansas. We can plot water level change versus water use, and it should plot as a linear relationship. So in the Sheridan 6 area, we've got now from 2002 on, we've got such a plot, and there's a best fit line with the R-squared, et cetera. Now, you'll notice that it's just 2002 to 2005, then 2008 to 12. Again, this is a pre-Lima run-up. We had a big snowstorm in December, late December of 6, early January 7. We could not get the water level measurements that year. So those aren't the 2007 change, or 2006 change and 2007 change are not given here. But you can see nice linear relationship. There's noise in the data because we're working with a relatively small number of wells. So if they reduce pumping, the theory says that they should just slide up that line and follow that line upward. And that's basically what happened. When the Lima was established, they reduced pumping, and you can see the green points here are all the values in the Lima period. And the line has shifted slightly simply because we didn't have any points up there in that section of the plot. So a few points can really cause things to shift a little bit. But the bottom line is that, notice the plot. Every year during the Lima, they've pumped less water than any year prior to the Lima establishment in this record. And 2009 was the wettest year, and you can see they pumped less than the wettest year prior to that. Water level change. Every year, the water level change has been less than the smallest water level change in the Lima run-up. So clearly, they've made a difference. And their average water level change is now around half a foot, when it was a little over 2 feet before. Now again, we have to qualify, this has not been tested under drought conditions, but clearly they're making a difference here. And although it doesn't appear they'll be able to stabilize water levels in this area without much larger cuts, we figure to be on the order of 40% in the lower 40s to stabilize water levels. These sorts of cuts can greatly extend the lifespan of the aquifer, and then you can hope that technology can help out and make further cuts perhaps more accessible to us. So anyway, the story of the Sheridan 6 Lima, they've been able to reduce pumping by over 25% in this period, had a significant impact on water level declines, and were able to make just as much money as their neighbors in the surrounding areas. So it is we consider it a success story, and as a result, the news has gotten out, and now there's more interest in Limas across the aquifer. In GMD4, you had the Sheridan 6, this 99 square mile area in Sheridan County, set up in 2013, but now we have a district-wide Lima that has been set up in 2018, and it is being challenged in court, but I think there's hope that it can withstand that challenge and become a strong vehicle for path forward toward a less dire future. In GMD1, which is in west central Kansas, they voted to have a district-wide Lima. They got some opposition a few years back. Now they're going back and they're doing it county by county, and they've had success in that area. Looks like they'll have one started next year in one of the counties. GMD5 in south central Kansas has proposed a Lima for an area of their district that is involved with an impairment complaint with a wildlife refuge. So there's moves afoot that have been encouraged by the success of this initial effort. And the idea again here is it's grassroots-driven initiatives that then are supported by regulatory oversight. And that seems to be able to garner much more support than in more draconian just regulatory actions, et cetera. So, we get a lot of questions at the survey from folks planning these Leamas about how much should I pump, how much do I need to reduce pumping to have a significant impact on decline rates. And one of the things we've done recently is to calculate how much pumping needs to be reduced to stabilize water levels across the High Plains Aquifer, and we'll show the results by groundwater management districts. And in western Kansas, we're talking in mid-20s to mid-30s pumping reductions, which stabilize water levels on average for the next few decades in western Kansas. Now, on average means that if you cut, like in northwest Kansas, 27%, like they did in the Sheridan 6 Lima, you're going to have some areas that are still decreasing, like Sheridan 6, but you'll have other areas that now are increasing. So on average, it is going to be stable. But if the real hot spots are going to have to do more heavy lifting. And in south central Kansas, it's a much more easier path to proceed, I think. Now, this is positive. I mean, the numerical models that have been made of these areas had cuts on the order of 75 to 85%. And one of the reasons is some of the parameters used in those models are not reflective of real field conditions. And that's the key here, is that we as hydrogeologists always have to make sure that the data that modelers use are reflective of real conditions. But there's some positive. I'm guardedly optimistic about conditions in western Kansas. When I get asked where things stand in western Kansas, I'll say the hour is clearly late, as you can see by the dark reds that we see across much of the aquifer there. But all is not lost. There's a lot that we can do to make a real difference to extend the lifespan of this aquifer and the critically important agricultural production that it provides. And with that, I am just going to bring this to a close with some acknowledgments and funding agencies. And in Kansas, we have a one-stop shop for information on the Kansas High Plains Aquifer Atlas. On the Kansas High Plains Aquifer, it's this Kansas High Plains Aquifer Atlas, digitally available. For those of you interested, yes, I do have refrigerator magnets that I brought with me. And we update this annually. Some references on work, and the two most recent references, 18 references on aspects of what I reported today, are down on that. I've got 2 or 3 copies down here on the table. And with that, I will bring it to a close and be happy to take any questions that folks might have. Thank you for your attention.
All right.
Thanks, James. The question I have is, you mentioned in the approach that shows the efficiency or how effective has been Lima. And one of the caveats that you pointed out was the climate hasn't tested yet the approach, right? No droughts.
Correct.
Is there any other factor that might challenge such approach? Let's say some other conditions, geological conditions, where, for example, infiltration or percolation is not as strong as in this particular area, and therefore Lima may not be the most suitable approach all over Kansas? Well,
one of the things you can do from the Did everybody understand the questions? The idea of this theoretical framework we've developed, this plotting of water level change versus water use, from the intercept of that plot, you can, well, from the slope, you can get information about the specific yield, which is a critically important parameter, which we rarely know in at the scale of such analyses. But from the intercept, you can get the net inflow, which is everything flowing into the aquifer minus everything flowing out, save pumping. So you get a feel for how much is coming in. And from that, you can get a good assessment of the impact of pumping reductions. And clearly, there will be certain situations that it's going to be much tougher to achieve the reductions that needed. You know, maybe the reductions are on the order of 55, 60%, that sort of thing, which would discourage Lima. We have not, I think the highest we've seen is in the lower 50s in certain areas in southwest Kansas that are basically isolated units geologically. So they're like stream channels that are cut off. So there's very little lateral flow into the system. And those sorts of contexts, it's you know, there's little that can be done other than dramatically reduce pumping.
All right, I have the microphone.
Okay.
Would you be kind enough to go back to your last graph? It was a plot of water use versus water level change. And I don't know if I can get you to speculate, but I noticed that your x-axis on that plot, not the
I'm trying to get there.
All right. So, just so everyone's ready, the x-axis on this plot starts with 12 so that you can zoom in on the data and see what you're trying to look at. But theoretically, as you reduce water use further and extrapolate, you would see some, if you took that line all the way out to the y-axis, the intercept wouldn't be where it looks like it would be on this as it's displayed, right? It would extend further up. So theoretically, that would be, you know, if you stopped pumping entirely, what the recovery might be. So what are your thoughts on that? Have you thought about
well,
that? Well,
the intercept there, I was a little perhaps too, I didn't go into the details there. The intercept is the net inflow over specific yield. So you can't, just by looking at that raw number, you can get fooled because of the specific yield. But in some of these areas, the pumping activity has set in place a framework. And say, like in the Sheridan 6 area, you have a trough in the water table, a regional trough. So you've got a lot of lateral inflow that's coming into play, as well as the vertical flow. And that will continue. If you completely cut off pumping, well, eventually that will go away, right? And then you'll be just dependent on the vertical flow. So you set up a kind of a groundwater development sets up a configuration that allows both the lateral and the vertical flow to be playing an important role here. And so this approach that we're using is valid for aquifers in the phase, what I'd call mature development. So you would not use this approach starting in some pristine aquifer to try to get a feel for what's going on. You want this development to have been going on for 10, 20 years, such as we have here in the High Plains Aquifer, in order to have a setting where this approach is valid. Does that make any sense?
In comparing the various areas how important is the depth to the aquifer in the context of how much you've lost or gained, or in terms of recharge, really?
Well, I think the depth of the aquifer is certainly increased the cost of pumping, obviously, and the deeper the aquifer, the less variation you'll see in terms of year-to-year changes in the vertical flow coming to the water table, because that thick vadose is basically going to be a low-pass filter, and so you're not going to get a great deal of variation through the thicker aquifers, thicker vadose zones. The big issue that we found is in the saturated thickness, is the aquifer thickness. And the thicker the aquifer, as I said earlier, the less enthusiasm it seems to generate in terms of folks wanting to pursue some of these options, which is unfortunate. We're hoping in southwest Kansas, where the aquifer can get quite thick along the Oklahoma border. But maybe that's not, maybe that's within the Kansas context. I know the High Plains Aquifer here in Nebraska is in fine shape, hundreds of feet thick. Okay, let's not talk about that. That seems to be a big factor in terms of encouraging movements in this area.
So on your stream channels, you've lost a lot of the upstream, downstream connectivity. Some of your upstream reaches actually you showed as still being perennial. Is Kansas doing anything along those reaches that when you do get flushes of inflows to slow that water down so it doesn't just gully wash? Or does it actually, when you get a big precipitation event, do you get connectivity into those reaches where you could slow that water down and force some of it into the ground?
Well, I can tell you at that site I showed the picture of on the Arkansas River there, nothing is getting there from Great Bend. Nothing has gone, from Garden City. Nothing has gone from Garden City along that full extent of the channel. That's where the Pawnee joins the arc there near the town of Larned. Nothing is coming from upstream. So everything, this is a great recharge experiment, right? Every time it rains in those stream channels, I would assume that we're getting very high rates of infiltration. And so I think in certain areas, if you notice the map of Kansas, you'll see all sorts of gullies there across the area. I would assume that there's a lot of preferential recharge occurring in those dry sand beds. The area there along the arc that you saw on that map between Colorado border and closing in on Garden City, the quality of that water that Colorado gives us is not good at all. And it's high in uranium, for one thing. And so one of the communities close to the borders had to put in a reverse osmosis plant to take the uranium out. That water, why does it stop right there, where I showed on the map? Because we still have surface irrigation in Kansas. And those surface irrigation districts have very senior water rights, and it's a volume of water, and they can take the whole river if they want, and they do at times. And so basically all that water gets shunted into an area essentially northwest of Garden City. Now, that's not such a great thing when it's got problems with uranium concentration being above the EPA limit. So that's one of the issues. Colorado is supposed to give us usable water, and I question whether that's usable.
At what stage, if any, would it be useful for a political scientist type to compare Lima as a management versus one of our NRDs?
I think there are a lot of projects that are moving in that direction. The NSF and USDA have this, what's it called, Infuse project, and that has supported some of my work and my colleagues and I work. And there's a variety of different universities that are looking at questions just like this. And maybe the Water for Food Institute is doing some work in this area as well that I'm not completely sure on. But I think that's useful. I don't have a good understanding of all the details of the NRDs.
All right, any other questions?
You know, this is very interesting. And I have to remind Nebraskans of how fortunate we are because of our Ogallala Formation. As a geologist, if I was going to design a water system, I would use Nebraska's, the Ogallala. You got the sand hills above it,
Yeah.
which drains water right straight to the Ogallala. Underneath it, you have shales, which prevent it from going everywhere. And so you have all this drainage into the rivers, the Platte River, et cetera, all those Elkhorns, the Loops, and so forth. We are so fortunate in Nebraska. And then I'm also asked once in a while, well, you know, we got a contract, a connection with the Ogallala, and a lot of that goes down to Kansas and Oklahoma and even Texas. And my deal to them is that you don't have to worry. The Republican River is our friend because it cuts clear down through, clear down through the Ogallala and into the Inland Shale, so you can't get water across there.
Well, my idea that I just came up with is why take this water from Missouri and ship it into western Kansas? Let's take it from the sand hills. We'd probably go downhill. We could do a deal here. I'm with it. You heard it here first. Dwayne, I appreciate I agree completely with what you said.
Yeah.
And you guys are very fortunate in that regard.
Yes, we are. And the fact that our NRDs are really responsible for a lot of this in Nebraska. So thank you very much. You're very brave. Come down here and talk to us about this.
Well, again, it's an honor to share the stage with you,
Well,
Dwayne.
hey,
So,
and yeah, thank you.
thank you.